UFC 167 just came to an end. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very good end. I kind of went rogue on that video. If you want to go back and take a look at it, you can. It's just absolutely disgusting to me that what happened actually happened. But another thing actually happened that night, and that was that a giant favorite, a 4, maybe 5-1 favorite, and a 5-1 underdog swap places, I guess. Robbie Lawler did not get the memo that he was the giant underdog against Rory MacDonald, who trains at TriStar with George St. Pierre, managed by Faraz Hobby. Pretty much the exact same deal. Was completely derailed, and it looked like just it was going to be either you got to fight GSP. He said, "I'm not going to fight George. Not going to fight George." Well, you don't have to worry about it now because you got beat up by Robbie Lawler. Now, Robbie Lawler, the best probably known for it. Unless you want to talk about Strikeforce back in the UFC, probably what you're going to remember is him being knocked out by Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz with the pit pat strikes. We hadn't seen too much of it going into it. The commentating, actually, Joe Rogan is a pop culture phenomenon. I mean, he's got his own show. He does the podcast. He's the color commentator. People hang on every single word that guy says. So if he says a guy's winning a fight or he likes this guy better than this guy, that has influence on most viewers. It really does. I listen to what Joe Rogan says sometimes. I get bored with him. It's not that I'm gonna mute the damn thing. I want to hear what's going on. It's just thank God that he's there, because if it was just Mike Goldberg, I don't think I could take it. Robbie Lawler took it to Rory MacDonald. He did it in Robbie Lawler fashion, only he's added more weapons to his repertoire. He hit much harder than Rory MacDonald did. Rory did secure several takedowns during the fight, and I actually was scared. I knew that Robbie should win the fight. Ethically, Robbie should have won the fight at the end of the third, and I'm thinking they're going to give it to Rory just because of takedowns alone. And of course, GSP was favored to win. Everyone thought he was going to win, and he didn't win, but he still took home the belt. So if it would have been Rory that won and GSP that won, those two would they would ended up fighting for a title, something that they both said that they would never do. Which is interesting. That's always interesting when something like that happens. I have yet to see that not happen. So, um, uh, Robbie Lawler came in. I believe he controlled from the opening bell. He was classic Robbie Lawler. Go straight forward, power shots. He kind of started pot shotting a little bit towards the beginning, the middle of the second round. Rory started to capitalize a little bit at the end of the bout, though. He secured a takedown, got into half guard, and started dropping some decent elbows on Robbie Lawler. So it's that's the that's the freshest thing in the judge's mind was Robbie being on his back in half guard, getting elbows smashed into his face repeatedly. So I was thinking, they're probably going to give it to, of course, Aries. MacDonald, and when the scores were red, split decision 29-28 for Lawler, I could not have been happier. Let me tell you why. There's a few reasons. Robbie Lawler came, he left the UFC, went to Strikeforce, fought for a title. He also fought dangerous people, really dangerous people that Strikeforce like to bring in people just kind of like at random. They brought in Fedor to fight Brett Rogers. They brought in Melvin Manhoff at one point. If you don't know who he is, look at some of the King of the Cage highlights. Look at his fight. Look at Melvin Manhoff versus Cyborg Santos on YouTube, and you'll see who Melvin Manhoff is. He's no fucking joke. He is a lethal striker, an absolute killer. Robbie Lawler, an absolute striker, elite striker, was backing up, scared, visibly scared of Melvin Manhoff. When there was one gap, I think Melvin Manhoff may have thrown a leg kick and overcommitted. Robbie threw one over the top, and it was lights out for Melvin Manhoff. So he does hold victories over some high-level competitors. Since he's been back in the UFC, I think he was the first fight was Bobby Volker, KO, and then he comes back. His last fight, he's never, ever looked better. He's never looked better than he did in his last fight. It was incredible, and that was against someone who I admire very much from my hometown of Pittsburgh, in Josh Koscheck, knocking him out, which set him up to fight the runner up for the title, which is Rory MacDonald, and he took it to him. I think he earned it. Rory MacDonald, where does he go from here? Dana White's not a big fan of him. He says he just likes to stall the action. He doesn't really like to push his own pace, but he likes to slow yours down. And his fight with Jake Ellenberger kind of backs that theory up. That fight it was billed. They have this big Twitter war, and fights like that usually do end up being stinkers. But come on, for real. What I want to see happen is, I also Googled Nick Diaz, and what I see a lot is Nick Diaz gotten into an altercation with Anthony Pettis inside of a nightclub, threw drinks on him. Just typical Nick Diaz. Here's what happened: Robbie Lawler is sliding up the top 10, while Nick Diaz is sliding down. That's not the only thing that's happening to Nick. Unfortunately, some of his fan base seems to be forgetting, where the loyalty lies. I'm a loyal Diaz fan. They like the way they fight. I like the way they fight. Win, lose, or draw, they go in there, take your head off, submit you, do whatever they can to win the fight. They have one particular method. It's their method that they patented. They use it, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful boxing, beautiful jiu-jitsu transitions. They could use, they take a little too many leg kicks, and they seem fairly easy to take down. They could work on both of those areas. It's quite simply, it's just always better to have more tools, and it's always better to be prepared for who you're going to fight. Nate Diaz is fighting Gray Maynard at the end of this week. So I was thinking, well, how awesome would it be? How fucking kick-ass would it be? Since Robbie Lawler is, let's face it, he's mainly remembered in the UFC back in the day by getting knocked out by Nick Diaz. So Robbie Lawler versus Nick Diaz too. The rematch. How does that sound to you guys? Let me know. Leave a comment. Do you like Robbie Lawler or Nick Diaz too? Now, remember, Nick Diaz was the first one to hand Robbie Lawler his UFC loss, and it wasn't by submission, and he did not point him. He knocked him out. Robbie Lawler got back to his feet after the knockout, talking shit to Nick. Nick put his hands up and continued to chase him. The referee let it go on a little bit. It was quite a shock. It was an upset victory for Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz made a name. Robbie Lawler, I think maybe won or lost one more fight in the UFC, and then moved on to other things. But what do you think? Nick Diaz, Robbie Lawler rematch. Could it work? Nick is currently number 10 on the official UFC rankings that I don't agree with at all. And Robbie Lawler has boosted himself up to the number 3 welterweight in the world, just behind George St. Pierre, Johnny Hendricks, Carlos Condit, and then himself, Ruthless Robbie Lawler. Underneath him is Rory MacDonald. So, it's got to slide down. Nick Diaz has to stay relevant. On Google, they're talking about his fan base sliding out. I'll be a Nick Diaz fan till the day I die. I'll be a Nate Diaz fan till the day I die. The fights they put on for me, I always remember. I can watch them over and over again. They've never been in a boring fight ever. The Benson Henderson fight, Nate Diaz was pretty much just defending himself after that first punch. He was pretty much done. Nick versus GSP, same deal. Their last 2 fights, they're both their title fights. I didn't feel like I got the whole Diaz experience, so I'm really pumped up to see Nate fight this weekend. Gray Maynard, who's ranked above him. Nate is ranked number 8, Gray number 5, Nick's number 10 and 3. But it doesn't seem to it doesn't seem to matter in any other division. I see number 10 guy fighting number 3 guy all the time. Damian Maia was ranked number 4 at welterweight. Jake Shields wasn't ranked at all. Jake Shields beat Damian Maia and still ranked beneath him. So, what do you think? Nick Diaz, Robbie Lawler too, or should Robbie Lawler maybe try and go for, there's Carlos Condit, Carlos Condit versus Robbie Lawler, and then to a title? Let me know what you think. Power Silver 101, Power Silver Nation, take care of each other.